Mary Maloney was waiting for her husband to come home from work. Now and again, she would glance up at the clock, but without anxiety, merely to please herself with the thought that each minute gone made it nearer the time when he would come home. The key turned in the lock. She laid aside her sewing, stood up and went forward to kiss him as he came in. She took his coat and hung it in the closet. Then she walked over and made the drinks. A strongish one for him, a weak one for herself. For her, this was a beautiful time of day. She was content to sit quietly, enjoying his company after long hours alone in the house. But tonight he did something strange, an unusual thing. He lifted his glass and drained it in one swallow, although there was still half of it, at least half of it left. He paused for a moment, leaning forward in the chair, and then he got up and went slowly over to fetch himself another. "I'll get it,"
"Sit down,"
he said, and when he returned, his glass was darker with the amber liquid in it. "Should I get
"No."
You know, I think it's terrible the way they keep a police officer as senior as you out on his feet all day long. I could get you some cheese or
"No."
If you're too tired to go out, then there's plenty of meat and stuff in the freezer."
"Sit down. Just for a minute, just sit down."
It was at this moment that she was afraid for the first
"Go
time.
on, sit. Listen, I've got something to tell you." And he told her. She sat very still through it, watching with kind of a dazed horror as he went further and further away from her with each word. "So there it is. I'll give you money, but there needn't really be any fuss. I hope not anyway. It wouldn't be very good for my job." Her first instinct was not to believe any of it, to reject it all. It occurred to her that perhaps he hadn't even spoken, that she herself had imagined the whole thing.
"I'll get the supper."
This time he didn't stop her. When she walked across the room, she couldn't feel her feet touching the floor. She couldn't feel anything at all. Everything was automatic now. Down the steps to the cellar, the light switch, the deep freeze, the hand inside the cabinet taking hold of the first object it met, a leg of lamb. She carried it upstairs, holding the thin bone end of it with both her hands, and as she went through the living room, she saw him standing with his back to her, and she stopped. "For God's sake," he said, hearing her but not turning around. "Don't make supper for me, I'm going out." At that point, Mary Maloney simply walked up behind him, and without any pause, she swung the big frozen leg of lamb high in the air and brought it down as hard as she could on the back of his head. The violence of the crash, the noise, helped bring her out of the shock. She stood there for a while, blinking at the body, still holding the ridiculous piece of meat tight with both hands. She told herself.
"I killed him."
It was extraordinary now how clear her mind had become all of a sudden. She began thinking very fast. As the wife of a detective, she knew quite well what the penalty would be. That was fine. It made no difference to her. And yet, she carried the meat into the kitchen, placed it in a pan, turned the oven on high, and shoved it inside. She knew the number to the police station. The car came very quickly. 2 policemen walked in. She knew them both. She knew nearly all the men at the precinct.
"Is he dead?"
"I'm afraid he is." Soon other men began to come into the house. There was a great deal of whispering and muttering beside the corpse, and the detectives kept asking her a lot of questions. She told her story. Patrick had come home, she was sewing, and he was tired, so tired he hadn't wanted to go out for supper. She told how she'd put the meat in the oven,
"It's still in there now, cooking."
and how she'd slopped out to the garden for vegetables and come back to find him lying on the floor. So they left her there while they went about their business searching the house. Her husband, they told her, had been killed by a blow to the back of the head, administered with a heavy blunt instrument, almost certainly a piece of large metal. They were looking for the weapon. It's the old story. Get the weapon and you've got the man. After a while, another detective came to her. "Look, Mrs. Maloney, you know that oven of yours is still on. The meat's still inside."
"Oh, could you do me a favor?
"We can try, Mrs. Maloney."
Could you and the other boys, it's much past your dinner time. Could you go ahead and eat that up? I couldn't touch a thing."
There was a good deal of hesitating amongst the 4 policemen, but they were clearly very hungry, and in the end they were persuaded to go into the kitchen and help themselves. The woman stayed where she was, listening to them speaking amongst themselves, their voices thick and sloppy because their mouths were full of meat. "Have some more, Charlie?" "Nah, better not finish it." "She wants us to finish it. She said so. Be doing her a favor." "That's a hell of a big club that guy must have used to hit poor Patrick," one of them was saying. "The doc said his skull was smashed all to pieces just like from a sledgehammer." "That's why it ought to be easy to find." "Whoever done it, They're not going to be carrying a thing like that around with them longer than they need to. One of them belched. Personally, I think it's right here on the premises. Probably right under our very noses. What do you think, Jack?
And in the other room, Mary Maloney began to giggle.
Keep it going for contestant number 4, Sarah Bell.